But moving ahead in our story before night falls, the Duke of Wellington once said about the sons of George III that they were the damnedest millstones hung round the neck of any public imaginable. Well, George III and Charlotte had produced, as I say, 15 children. 7 of them were male. And the Prince of Wales, again, we have a Prince of Wales, named George, of course, the eldest son, was by far and away the most interesting and the most cultivated of the whole gang of progeny. He had a long career, first as Prince of Wales, then as Prince Regent, as we'll see, and finally as king. He was an ebullient, full of energy young man who was filled with the vim, vigor, and vitality of life. He was romantic, outgoing, expansive, and he was rather clever, very clever indeed. Now, his brothers, some of them were similarly endowed, but not as he. And the father, George III, was a typical autocrat of the household. He believed in controlling his children and keeping these sons in line. And of course, one son, how many of you have had juvenile sons? Well, if they've been sons, they've been juveniles at one point. And to have a whole gang of them, it was a terrible challenge, and he failed, but he stifled them. This was done by law in many ways. Laws were promulgated to control the royal family. And finally, the Prince of Wales was able to go out on his own. When he was 21, he was given an independent income by the House of Commons, and he could set up his household wherever he wished, and he did in London. He took his frustrations out in high living and self-indulgence. Remarkable, right? Yeah. He began to build himself a townhouse for the first thing. He called it Carlton House, and it was a magnificent structure. It was really a palace. None of it exists today except the portico. And when you go to London, if you go to the National Gallery of Art, you will see his portico, because when they tore down Carlton House, they saved the portico. And when they built the National Gallery, they put the portico up as the entrance to it. It's huge, so you can get an idea of the scale of Carlton House. Anyway, young George, the prince, had a remarkable pattern of being infatuated with older women, which speaks well for him, I would say. When he was only 24, in 1784, I think it was, he fell in love with Maria Fitzherbert. She was a twice widowed matron, several years his senior, very handsome, extremely good looking, but she was also very respectable. She was an intellectual, well-read, well-informed. She was an amateur botanist of no mean ability, and very careful of her reputation. Well, George had seen her at some public function, and he just was smitten, and he had to know who it was. And then when he found out, he sent gifts and flowers and so on to her house. And when they met in public, which was seldom, he threw himself at her feet, declaring his love and adoration, and wouldn't, you know what he wanted. Well, she did too. And she wouldn't have anything of it. She said, this is just humiliating. This was undignified in her view. Now, he was the Prince of Wales, so you didn't kick at him. But it was embarrassing to her, and she stopped going out in public, and he continued to pursue her remorselessly. Well, finally, she decided the only way to stop this is for me to get out of the country. So she went to visit friends in France and stayed for several months. But he sent messages, and he sent friends over to petition her, and finally he said he would marry her, and she said, oh, sure you will. She's no fool. But then he sent over his good friend Lord Malmesbury with a contract which said, in effect, that he would marry her and make her his queen consort when he became king. And he would do so in her religion. Well, now we come to something important, the Royal Marriages Act of 1772. This was pushed through the House by the King George III, his father, which stipulated very clearly that the royal princes who were heir to the throne in succession could not marry commoners, divorced persons or Catholics. Well, Mrs. Fitzherbert was a commoner, to be sure. She was not divorced, she was widowed, and she was a devout Catholic. Well, George said he would marry her in her own faith. Well, here was this contract now. Well, George wasn't a monster, for goodness sakes. He was just a little over-enthusiastic, shall we say. And he was the Prince of Wales. And being queen was not to be sniffed at. So Mrs. Fitzherbert said, well, all right. And she returned to London. George arranged everything. The marriage would take place in her townhouse, I think the day she arrived, at midnight, with a priest he had found to perform the ceremony. And no one would know anything about it. It was going to be a complete secret. And nobody did know anything about it until they read the Times the next morning. Well, this marriage took place in 1785, and they began living in Carlton House. Maybe not broadcasting the idea of marriage, but the prince had had mistresses before, and the public sort of went that direction. But by about 2 years passed, and he had run up such huge debts with his building program and other expenditures that he was desperate for money. So he petitioned Parliament for a rise in his income. And the parliamentary committee that heard this petition, the chairman said to the prince, in effect, but Your Highness, we understand that you have married a Catholic and taken yourself out of the line of succession. What? Said the prince. Married a Catholic? What are you talking about, sir? Monstrous. Your Highness is not married? Married? What do you think I am? The Royal Marriages Act will tell me what to marry. What are you doing, sir? Would we take that as a no? Well, the prince was very convincing, and he got his rise in incomes. But he had to deal with Mrs. Fitzherbert. She had been crushed. I mean, for goodness sakes, he had denied her existence in effect, rejected her. Well, it took him months and months to convince her that, my dear, it means nothing. I love you and you alone in my life. You are my wife and my beloved, and so on and so forth. Well, finally, very convincing. She returned to his arms, and they went on living together. In fact, they went down to Brighton to visit friends, and they saw a nice property there, and they bought it. It was a large house on the Stane River flowing into the sea right there at Brighton. And they began to rebuild it. It was first called the Brighton Cottage, and then the Brighton House, and eventually it became Brighton Pavilion. How many of you have seen Brighton Pavilion? Yes, a number of you. Isn't it fabulous? Absolutely fabulous. Disney World hasn't a clue. Well, all during this period, the king and queen there at Windsor had ignored anything their son was doing regarding Mrs. Fitzherbert. No, that was never, totally in denial, as we'd say today. But by 95, by the middle of the 90s, only a few years hence, after the expenses that they were putting out for the pavilion and everything else, the Prince of Wales was in such desperate debt that his creditors were threatening to take him to court, and if he didn't pay up, they would haul him into debtor's prison. The Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne, debtor's prison, never! Well, the prince was in a terrible way about this, and one day he received a message from his father, a summons to appear at Windsor. Well, you don't, whatever the king commands, you obey. And so he went up to Windsor, spent a few days with his family, and at dinner one evening, and the king and the prince were not on good terms. The king said, "Now, George, my boy, I understand that you're having financial difficulties and in a great debt." "Yes, Father." "Well, I think maybe I can help you with this and give you a solution. If..." "Yes, Father, if what?" "Well, I can help you if you will marry a girl of my choosing." "Marry a girl? But I love Mrs. Fitzherbert. She's my wife. I don't want another wife. I have the wife I want." He didn't say this to the king. What was he to do? The creditors were killing him. They were going to murder him and take him to prison. "Oh, all right, I'll do it." 3 minutes. Well, the king and queen had already chosen their favorite niece for the bride-to-be, Caroline von Brunswick. This was the queen's favorite niece, certainly. The Prince of Wales, going along with it, of course, sent his good friend Lord Malmesbury to Braunschweig to bring back the bride. Now, Malmesbury knew how fastidious the Prince of Wales was. So what he found in Braunschweig horrified him. Here, when he finally found her, she was hip-deep in horse excrement, shoveling away, screaming epithets, all covered with perspiration, a rag around her head, screaming her lungs out. My God, what was it going to do with this truculent hoyden who had never seen the benefits of training as a princess? Well, for 2 weeks, he educated the princess in the art of the washcloth and the toothbrush. Tailors and dressmakers were brought in to bind up her rather ample figure. And finally, when he had her in a condition that would be passable, he rushed her to London before she could spoil. He hurried her on to Carlton House, placed her in the salon of the window with the light behind her, and then he went off to summon the prince and tell him that his bride awaited him. The prince came in, walked across the room, looked at Caroline up and down through his quizzing glass, said, "My God, Malmesbury, get me some brandy, I'm ill," and walked out of the room without saying a word to Caroline. She in turn says, "Was machen Sie? Was ist los mit mein Prinz? What's the matter with him? What's he doing?" Well, it didn't matter how the prince saw his bride. The wedding took place anyway. The Prince of Wales was so drunk that they had to hold him up on both sides. And evidently he was able to go through the wedding night with some degree of success. When the servants came in the next morning to awaken the Prince and Princess of Wales, they found the prince in his nightshirt on the floor with his head in the fireplace resting on the grate, asleep. Well, the prince would not stay in the same chamber with his wife another night. They lived in different parts of Carlton House. And in a few weeks, the princess announced, as we used to say, that she had quickened. And there was a great sigh of relief on George's part, because in 9 months, she gave birth to a daughter who was named Carlotta or Charlotte after the Queen Mother. And then the prince took the baby daughter away from his wife, telling her that she would never have anything further to do with the child. And then he sent Caroline off to live in a country house near Windsor. He returned now to the arms of guess who? As Mrs. Fitzherbert was wheeled out again, well, actually, she wouldn't have anything to do with him. She was so furious that he would literally throw her into the street and reject her for this mechanical marriage just for the money. Well, she realized the money was a big issue and she had to understand that. But the rejection, as it seemed to her, was just terribly painful. But George went after her and pursued her virtually nonstop for months on end, and finally, after a couple of years of wooing her back, she returned to him. Well, they went on with their life at Brighton Pavilion. It was a giddy life, I must say, full of excitement and banquets and horse racing and gambling and it just went on and on and on. Until Mrs. Fitzherbert finally tired of his indiscretions with other grandmothers. And she left him for good and all in 1810, never to return. She went to live, she always maintained a house there in Brighton. She didn't actually live in the pavilion with him. And she had a house elsewhere in London, and she was on good terms with some of his sisters, the royal princesses, and some of his brothers. She had a very substantial social life. She was a successful woman the rest of her life. She outlived the prince. Caroline, the Princess of Wales, had been forcibly exiled, as she saw it, to this house out near Windsor. And she was always welcome at Windsor with her parents-in-law. The king and queen, of course, loved her and received her, and she spent a lot of time with them. But, the fun and the games were with her husband. Not that her husband was any delight in her life, but his society was very giddy, and she was not any part of it. She resented this terribly. And besides, he'd appointed Lady Jersey as her first lady in waiting to oversee her and watch out for her. Lady Jersey was another one of his grandmothers that he had an affair with many years before. She was a very attractive woman, I must say, but she resented it too. She was exiled along with the princess. It was very uncomfortable for everybody. Well, finally, next year, in 1812, I guess it was, Caroline said, to hell with it, I'm not staying here another minute. And she left England. She went back to Europe. And there she became the most complete eccentric in history, it seems. Oh my goodness, poor woman. Well, this was shortly after, I think it was shortly after the Napoleonic finally defeat Waterloo and all of this had happened. And Europeans were celebrating in Paris, ball after ball taking place. And at one of these, she appeared, stripped to the waist. What an impression she must have left. She was not exactly sylphan. And many of the young ladies went nearly déshabillées. That was the fashion of the time. But on the Princess of Wales, it was maybe a little bit too outré. Some time later, she appeared at a hunt party. And of course, there were a lot of famous people, kings and so on there. And she rode up on her horse with her riding habit and her equerry. And she was wearing half a pumpkin strapped to her head, carved out in sort of a cup. She said, it keeps my head cool. Well, she needed a cool head, I guess. She didn't seem to keep one very long because she ended up in Italy sleeping with her coachman. Well, I must say he was a handsome, hairy fellow, but still. Her friends said, now, Her Highness is sleeping with her servants. Prince George, her husband, had been keeping a dossier on her spies, watching her every move. They were clicking away, or whatever they did then, reporting back every indiscretion imaginable, because George was lining it up to get rid of her. Well, during this period, before and after 1815, the Napoleonic Wars had taken place, of course. And the flower of England had gone off to fight Napoleon, including a couple of George's brothers. He stayed at home. He was living it up there at Carlton House in the Brighton Pavilion. And the public saw him as a coward and a slacker. Well, it wasn't true. George had a regiment. He was the colonel of it. He petitioned frequently to Parliament and his father to be allowed to go abroad and fight at the head of his troops. But under the Act of Succession, and the revision of it, anybody in the line of succession, the male members, were not allowed to leave the country in time of conflict because they had to be protected for the succession. Well, the public didn't know this. They were all still looking at Fox News and all of this. They hadn't a clue. So they saw the prince in this terrible light, which was unjust, inequitable. Well, in 1817, there was a domestic tragedy. The daughter of the Prince and Princess of Wales had married, she was now 20, and she had married Prince Leopold of Belgium. but within months she died in childbirth. So the Prince and Princess of Wales had no issue. And now the prince ordered all of his 6 brothers to get busy, get married, and produce children. Well, the Duke of York was married and separated, so this may have compromised him on the religious issue. The Duke of Clarence was in the Navy, hard to get him off the damn boat and into the marriage bed, but they were going to try. The Duke of Kent, likewise, he'd been in his mistress' bed for 20 years, and he didn't want to leave it, but they yanked him out of that and made him marry the widowed Princess of Saxe-Coburg. God knows what that would produce. The Duke of Sussex won't leave his common-law wife. You could take the crown and you know where you could put it. So he was out of it. The Duke of Cambridge was the Viceroy of Hanover, so he was out of the succession. The Duke of Cumberland, oh my God, he was a monster. He had just killed his valet in a sex scandal. Well, nobody, oh my goodness, no. But they were all ordered to get busy and start poking, and they did. It wasn't 3 years later, in 1820, that old King George III, 83 years old, forgotten by his subjects, finally died. And now, the Prince Regent was King George IV. Well, the newspapers of Europe carried the news, and Caroline read it in the newspaper. She was now queen consort, and if you think she was going to stay in Italy and out of sight, you're mistaken. Well, during his Prince Regency, he had tried to buy her off to keep her out of the country, and now they threatened her, but she was not to be deterred. She threw her underwear into a trunk and headed back for England. And when she arrived in Portsmouth, she received the greatest ovations since the landing of Charles II in 1660 and the restoration of the monarchy. You see, the public had a vision of the couple. When they were Prince and Princess of Wales, the princess was seen publicly as the put-upon miserable victim of this ogre of a husband. Does this ring a bell? The same imbecile public that we saw drooling and slathering over Diana a few years ago were still active in this early period of time. They saw this unfortunate woman as their heroine. They dragged her coach to London. They made over her flowers and banquets and everything. Well, the Prince of Wales, now the king, he was simply furious. This damned woman. So he began to put forward his annulment program before the House of Lords. A petition was presented for annulment based on this fat dossier of her indiscretions. And she had to come before a Lords committee and testify, which she did. The king never made an appearance, of course. And of course, because the mobs of London were just swarming around the House of Lords, ringing her praises and shouting her name and carrying banners, the whole thing, what was the House to do? Well, the Lords felt that if they sided with the princess, of course, they could never work with the king again. But if they sided with the king, the mob might tear them to pieces. What was to be done? My lords, said somebody at the back. Tomorrow is recess. Table the motion. So they tabled the motion for annulment, and there it died. King George IV was still saddled with his wife. Well, he had been planning a fabulous coronation. He intended it to be nothing like in English history, and it never was. There was nothing like it then or since. Absolutely fabulous. But he didn't want anybody there that shouldn't be there. So a special carte d'entrée was given to each guest, signed, and nobody got in without a cart. Well, guess who wasn't receiving a cart? It didn't deter Caroline. She'd hired her coronation dress and her coach and attendants, and she arrived at Westminster Abbey on the time, And up the steps she went. Well, George knew she'd pull something. So he had wrestlers placed at all the doors to prevent it. And she couldn't get in the front door. She went around the side portico. No, they wouldn't let her in there. She ran across them. The mob was going crazy. Yay, Carol in the television or whatever. She ran around the other portico. She tried to burst through, push through. They hurled her back into the arms of her attendants. Oh, it was just, the crowd was hysterical. But she gave up, and in tears she went back to her coach and back to her hired lodgings, defeated. Well, the coronation rolled ahead. It was splendid, banquets and marches and fireworks, and it just went on and on for days. It was fabulous, fabulous, fabulous. George was a mountain of diamonds and ermines in the middle of it, just lapping it up. Well, after the thing finally stopped, he thought this is the time to leave London while the eyes of the public are simply bedazzled. So he decided on a tour of the dominions, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and so on. 18 months later, he was in Ireland. The Irish loved him. He was having a lovely time with the Irish. He received a message from London. Her Majesty the Queen is dead. He was referring to his wife. Well, what a relief. But he knew that he had treated her shabbily. She was such an unfortunate choice for a wife. He couldn't help his feelings of being repelled by her, but he also felt guilty about his treatment of her. This was not the time, however, to go back to London during her obsequies. So he decided to go to Europe and visit Hanover, the land of his forebears. He'd never done that. So off he went. Spent months in Europe. And finally, it was time to return home. He crossed over at Dover, at Calais, actually. And when he was crossing through, the town was alive to see the king. And it was at Calais that King George IV saw one he hadn't seen in years. The someone was George Brian Brummell, known as Beau. Well, they had met, we have to go back a number of years. They had met when Brummell was in his teens and George was in his 20s. It was a country house. The Prince of Wales had gone for a visit as he was, some event. And here was this teenage boy, still in school. George loved his youth, his controlled impudence, and his style. Prince George, he surrounded himself with stylish young people. And before they separated that day, the prince said, "I say, Brummell, if you're ever in London, look us up." "I will, sir, I certainly will." Well, a few months later in London, at a reception at Carlton House, here was young Brummell. "I say, Brummell, good to see you. Come on over here." And they began to chat, and pretty soon they were palling around. The next day they saw each other, they became chums. Now, he had a lot of chums, so Brummell simply joined the group. And shortly, Brummell moved into London to live. And the prince saw to it he was gazetted into the 10th Hussars, gave him a little income, and gave him an entree to the Carlton House court. He could appear at the prince's levees, for instance. Now, Brummell was never a fop or a dandy. This is totally a misunderstanding on the ignorant public's part. His issues, well, for instance, he was very severe in his dress. He dressed very simply always, and he was pathologically clean. And on that point, it was a revolution because we were not very tidy in that period of time. The Prince of Wales was fastidious and could maintain it, as were other gentlemen, but most of us, we powdered our hair for one thing, and we only bathed maybe every few months. Well, hauling the hot water up from the kitchens, the maids and the upstairs, and by the time you got it there it was cold, and they had to bring more hot water, and they poured it in your lap, and that was not comforting. And it was cold in the room, and bathing was simply awkward. And you slept in your shirt frequently, or you wore it all week long if you didn't sleep in it. And the little critters formed, And they would crawl around, and you had to have something in your pocket to sort of get in there. The nice thing about the powder, it killed the lice. But while they were still marching around in there, you could feel it. And they would come down on the collar. You know. In church, you could watch the man in front of you, woman. Well, you had to do something in church, and so on and so forth. And we wore tight breeches and silk stockings and a lot of lace, which frequently got in the food. So all of this was there. And Brummell changed all this. He cut his hair very short, washed it every day. He changed his linen 3 or 4 times a day. His linen had to be spotless. He wore long, tight, tailored clothing. Some of the trousers, they were called trousers, reached below the calf. Nobody had seen this before. Well, the prince thought these were sort of clever, and it sort of helped to narrow down his growing bulk. So he adopted them. Well, anything the prince did, everybody else did too, because he was the fashion setter of the time. So they became the center of the nouveau habiliment, and everybody followed it. Beau's motto was never too tight, too stiff, or too fashionable. And this is the motto of gentlemen to this very day. Of course, there are very few gentlemen still living, but the few that are around maintain this motto. And anybody hoping to become a gentleman would maintain that. His lifestyle was his genius. Every hostess in London wanted him at her table at least once during the season. He was so funny, so witty, so charming. He could dish society scandals like nobody. He was great at cards. He gambled heavily, and he was good at, making everybody was a comfortable partner. He was just a delightful person to have around, and the prince found it so. He was manic in his fastidiousness. His endless shirt changes, all of this sort of thing. It was legendary in his life. And when he dressed for dinner, he was carried in a sedan chair to his hostess' house. You know what a sedan chair is? 2 bearers and a box in the middle. Well, this was brought right into his foyer, bearer's chair and all, inside the house. He went from his dressing room down to the chair, got in, they shut the door, and then they carried him out of the house and down, or wherever he was going, into his hostess's foyer, inside. Generally, the bearers leave you on the street. Nope, inside, open the door, out he would step in perfect shape, not a speck of dust. His career at court lasted for 24 years. It was a long career as the prince's nearest and dearest. But there's something here now that's very important to understand. It's largely lost on contemporary society. To be the intimate or favorite of a great person was something very difficult to negotiate properly, because you had to remember that you were always a step back, a step down. You always addressed them not in their first name, ever, but always as Mr., or in his case, Highness, or Prince, or Sir. That's the least you can say. This obtains to women too, whomever. You can, over years, as he did, feel close, loved, adored, cherished, above reproach, the most intimate of intimates. But you must remember in your mind that there is a wall between the two of you, and you would never cross that wall and become familiar. Familiarity kills any relationship. And so you always remain a little distance to allow them to know that they are the superior person. And this essential deference is awfully hard for Americans. They don't have a clue. That's why their societies are so awful and messy and, sort of chaotic. But this, in a class gauge society, this is very important. Now, that's where Beau Brummell fell a cropper after 24 years. He felt that he could do no wrong. He felt so comfortable in the prince's presence. And at a dinner party one night at Brighton Pavilion, there were several dining rooms, and he was in the dining room with his group, and they were all having a hideously wonderful time, just screaming with laughter over his jokes. He made an offhand remark about Mrs. Fitzherbert's rotundity. Everybody screamed with laughter, but they gossiped. Somebody told the prince. The next day, the prince was rather cool. "Oh, Brummell," I say, "there you are," and turned away to talk to somebody else. Well, Brummell realized he'd said this stupid thing. Oh, it was stupid. Only he'd bitten his tongue. So, he's like many of us in this position, we feel we are so safe we can laugh it down. And he tried to top it with something, and it was worse. The prince glared at him. They began to see less and less of each other. Pretty soon they weren't seeing each other at all. Months passed and they hadn't visited. Then in London at an assembly is public rooms that are hired, and musicians and buffet, and people come to dance a little, to change, to meet each other and so on. It's sort of pell-mell, very gracious, civilized people only. And Brummell was there with his friend Lord Moira, greeting the people, "How do you do, how do you do," and so on, all working the crowd. And he turned, he didn't know it, but the prince was also attending. And he was face to face with Prince George, who was attended by Lord Alvanley. And there was a moment of silence. They stared at each other. And then Brummell, leaning around the prince, said, "I say, Alvanley, who's your fat friend?" Well, people literally fell to this. Oh my God, how awful. Brummell turned and walked away, which you never do in front of a prince. The prince turned scarlet. Well, that was the end of any possible friendship they might have had. Could not be reasonable. When Brummell's creditors realized that he'd been abandoned by his patron and he'd run up huge debts. He had a very handsome townhouse filled with beautiful paintings and treasures, a jewelry collection. He had a carriage and horses. He was running a horse in the races, had a racehorse and jockey, and all these things were on credit. Vast debts. And the creditors moved in on him to take everything. And Brummell fled the country. He went to live in France. Went to Paris, that didn't work out. He moved back to Calais, hoping for the summons home. Well, when his money ran out, he finally got himself a job at the excise office there in Calais and lived on shabbily, getting worse, his health failing. And then in 1822, the news spread in Calais, "The King of England is coming, the King of England is coming." Well, everybody in town turned out to see the King of England. And Brummell heard the news, and he pulled himself together. He was in bed, he was not well. Put on his shabby clothes, dusted himself off, and polished his hat, and went downstairs. Crowd on the sidewalk, milling around, shouting, pushed his way through to the curb. Here came the carriage with the portly King of England, waving to the people on either side. He stepped out from the curb, bowed his graceful bow, removed his hat, and George saw him. That shock of red hair turning gray, turned aside and waved to the public, snubbing Brummell for the last time. Beau Brummell lived on in Calais until his death 20 years later. At the age of 62, well, King George IV, was very popular in his dominions. He went on to Scotland during this period after his wife's death, and the Scots loved him. You should have seen him in his kilt. He was a vision. But he had been spending vastly, as he always did. Over all the years, he'd spent some £500,000 on the pavilion. That was probably, $16 million or $15 million today. A huge sum of money. And as king, interestingly enough, George IV turned reactionary. Now, when he was the prince, he was all on the left, badgering his father with his leftist politics. But now he was the king, so he became a right-winger. That's the way it seems to work. And he fought against the Catholic Emancipation Bill in 1829. And it was defeated, which is an irony considering his long relationship with Mrs. Fitzherbert and her Catholicism. But in private, George IV was a delightful person. He was an irresistible mimic, very witty, lots of fun to be around. He always held an open house until the last. But he was gaining huge weight. He was up to 400 pounds. He was simply vast. The table reflected it. He had a French chef providing the guests, and they were, it was delicious, yum, yum, yum. But it finally petered out when he began to die of gout and edema. He was just having his heart was failing, there's no question about it. He became a recluse at Windsor, which he was rebuilding. He abandoned the pavilion, never went back. It was no longer a part of his life. And in 1830, at the age of 70, George IV died. Now, he was the most unpopular king in English history up to that point. But he was also the most distinguished in taste and talent, no question. You know, if it weren't for George IV, we wouldn't have the famous Guildhall. I don't know how many of you feel, but that's a vast, beautiful structure in central London. Many functions take place there. At Windsor Castle, which he had rebuilt and redesigned. Buckingham House, which of course is now Buckingham Palace, was rebuilt by his workers. Brighton Pavilion, the most famous. And the Tower of London, all that complex was redesigned and refurbished and rebuilt. And all the interior, the furniture and the plate and everything, all of this was his work. I don't mean he did it with his fingers, I mean he had it done with artisans. Now his efforts are appreciated as the greatest tourist attractions in England, whereas in 1830 everybody hated him. He was succeeded by his brother William, the Duke of Clarence, who became William IV, the sailor king. Well, they finally got him off the boat and into bed. He had married Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, and they had produced, finally, after many years, a little boy. And that was going to be the heir to the throne. I mean, the little boy was. But he died. And shortly thereafter, William died in 1837. Who next? Well, then came the next duke, the Duke of Kent. Well, he had died some years before, but he and his wife, he had finally found one and managed something, they had produced a little girl who was now 18. And she became the heir. Her name was, and I hope you come next month to hear about her.